Now, right in front of the Sears, you see this building. It looks like a chess piece with the light green barrels on top. That's the Queen, or 311 South Wacker Drive. But we're going to start with the Princess. And the Princess is this building over here to the right that has a statue on top. It's kind of hiding behind this residential building, but it's coming into view here. Now, this building is another Art Deco building from 1929. It's the Chicago Board of Trade building. And that statue on top is a statue of the Roman goddess Ceres. Now, Ceres was the goddess of agriculture, you know, farming. And so that's fitting for this building because that's where the city originally traded agricultural futures. Now, the statue on top, the sculptor used a West Side barber's 14-year-old daughter as a model for the sculpture, for the statue. And she later went on to become Miss Cook County. So pretty cool claim to fame though, right? Like, to be able to point to a building and be like, hey, you see that statue on top? That's me. Maybe someday. All right, back to the Queen, this building straight ahead with the barrels, and I'm going to focus on those barrels. Now, this building was built in 1990, and those barrels at night were illuminated with over 1,800 fluorescent tube lights. Now, most of those lights have been replaced with LED bulbs or more energy-efficient bulbs, and that's because those lights are more easily dimmed. Why does that matter? Well, when the building was first built at night, the top of it was so bright that migrating birds in the spring and fall would mistake the roof of the building for the moon. That's a true story, and birds use the moon at night to help them navigate. So it caused a lot of problems. They'd fly around in circles, they'd run into the building. So that's why now, twice a year, the spring and fall months, the roof of that building, those lights are dimmed during migration season so they don't interrupt the birds' flight patterns.
Edificios.
All right, so that brings us to the king himself, the Sears or Willis Tower, depending on who you ask. Now, in 1974, the Sears department store builds the tallest building in the world here in the Windy City. That's the Sears Tower. Now, they left in the 90s, Sears did. They left the city and the building, which was a bummer for us. They were a big employer. But then a few years ago, the Willis Insurance Group signed a lease for 3 floors of office space in that building. But there was also a clause in that lease that said for an extra $1 million a year, they could also lease the naming rights. So that means for $1 million a year, Willis Insurance Group gets to call that building the Willis Tower. Now, I've been in Chicago long enough, I consider myself a local, and like the locals, I'm stubborn. So I call it the Sears Tower. But the actual name is the Willis Tower. Now, this building is actually designed to sway in the wind, much like 150 North Riverside. So they have to think about that when they're designing it. And it actually can sway up to 3 whole feet in either direction. Though on an average day, it only sways about 6 inches. And yes, you can feel the building swaying when you are in it. Now, this building clocks in at 1,451 feet tall. But how do you determine the height of a tall building? Well, the Council on Tall Buildings, yes, that's the actual name of the council, real original, I know. They determine to measure a building's height, you have to start at the threshold of the lowest open-air public entrance, so that's the bottom of the lowest public door, all the way to the top of the structure or permanent spire. Now, permanent spire, that's relevant here, because those 2 antennas are not considered permanent, and therefore they do not count towards the overall height of the building. All right, now, as we pass by here, you see this gap in these 2 buildings. You can look up all the way towards the top of that tall tower, and you see those 4 glass boxes sticking out of the side of the building there. Now, those are actually observation decks called the Ledge. Unfortunately, they are closed right now, but they should be opening in a few weeks. And so you can purchase a ticket and walk up in those glass boxes out onto the glass floor and look down below all the way to the street. Now, if that sounds like fun to you, go for it. If you have vertigo or are afraid of heights, please don't. It will be a very unpleasant experience for you. Now remember, those antennas are not considered permanent. But to give you some context, those antennas are about 280 feet tall, which makes them the same height as this black box building over here to the left. So absolutely massive antennas, right? Now, 2 people have successfully climbed the Sears Tower. The first was American climber Dan Goodwin. He dressed up like Spider-Man and used suction cups to attach his hands and feet to the windows outside. You think that's crazy? French climber Alain Robert came on the scene and he climbed the entire height of the Sears Tower with no equipment whatsoever. Absolutely crazy, right? Now you can look over here to the left and you can see there's a train, an Amtrak train, through these vents. Now, the train companies do own the rights to the land that the train tracks are on. That's standard for train companies, but also they actually own the rights to the air above the tracks. So what does that mean for buildings that want to build on top of tracks? Well, each lot on this side of the river has to spend an extra $1 million a year to lease the air above the tracks. I know, I never thought someone would figure out a way to rent air, but it's Chicago. We get things done, we figured it out, right? All right, now Chicago has a lot of nicknames. You might have heard some of them before. Second City is one of them. You might have heard of the famous comedy club. You actually know the reason why it's called Second City, and that's because the first city burnt down. So that's where the nickname comes from. The Windy City, it's not because it's windy, although it is windy here. That actually comes from the World's Fair. So back when the locals were campaigning to host the World's Fair, they went to Washington, and apparently they talked a lot. So the Washington politicians referred to them, this is a true story, as those windbag blowhards from Chicago. So that's where the Windy City nickname comes from. But I say jokes on them because we got the fair, didn't we? Now we're also the city that works. That's another nickname. We do have a lot of working class people here in the city, but also we're just a city that functions. We're well-rounded. We have a vibrant arts and culture scene. Here on the right we have the Civic Opera Building. This is the second largest opera building in the country. It's got about 3,600 seats in it. And we have over 200 theater companies in the city of Chicago, ranging in size from small little 60-seat storefront theaters all the way up to huge cultural mainstays like Steppenwolf Theater, the Goodman Theater, or Chicago Shakespeare Theater, which is out on Navy Pier. Now, fun fact about your docent, I graduate with my master's in acting in 5 days, and I cannot wait for these theater companies to open back up so I can tread the boards once again. But in the meantime, I'll get my fix here telling you all my cow jokes. Now, we're also the city that works because we are the city that eats. Lots of good food here in the city. Some of my favorites, we have Chicago-style hot dogs, deep dish pizza, Italian beef, Italian ice, popcorn, basically all the things you need for a well-balanced breakfast.
Pizza.
Now, if you're looking for some good deep dish pizza, Lou Malnati's and Giordano's are 2 chains here in Chicago that have great deep dish pizza. But for my money, the best deep dish pizza in the city is at Pequod's Pizza. That's P-E-Q-U-O-D, and it's a little further north of here in a neighborhood called Lincoln Park. So if you have the opportunity to head up there, I recommend it. It's fantastic. Also, pro tip. Whatever you do, if you order a hot dog in Chicago, do not ask for ketchup on it. I can't really tell you why that's a rule, but it is. And if you ask for ketchup, you will be shamed by everyone around you. But if you want it Chicago style, which is my favorite way to have a hot dog, ask for it to be dragged through the garden, seriously. And that's going to come with pickles, peppers, relish, onions, tomatoes, and mustard. My favorite way to eat a hot dog. Also, I got some recommendations for where to find them if you're looking after the tour. All right, now the Lake Street Bridge. This is another iconic Chicago-style bridge on the river here. Now, these bridges raise and lower about 50 to 60 times a year, a few times for maintenance, but mostly in the spring and fall when boats are traveling between the river and the lake. So boats will spend the winter on the south branch where we just came from, and they'll travel up the river in pods of about 12 with their masts up, and city workers raise and lower the bridges one by one for them to pass through. Pretty cool sight if you have the opportunity to see it. Now, over on the left, you see that construction there. That's the future Salesforce Tower. And this is going to be finished hopefully in about 2 years or so, and it'll be taller than the two buildings on either side. And I pointed out because it's a great example of how the river's edge is always transforming. There's always something new to see on the river. If you come in a year, you're going to see something new. All right. Now I'm going to do my first of 2 repeats, but that's because there's a lot to talk about. This massive Art Deco building straight ahead on the left, remember this is the merchandise mart. This was the... Gets me every time. This was the first Art Deco building we talked about, and it has 27 floors, but that's a little misleading because it also has 43 elevators, 96 total acres of floor space, which is the equivalent of 73 American-sized football fields. It has its own L-stop, its own firehouse, its own police station, and until recently, true story, it had its own zip code. That's totally true. It also occupies 2 whole city blocks, so an absolutely massive building. Now over here on the right, besides this beautiful dress, we have this glass box mounted on the side of the Riverwalk there. And in that glass box is an $8 million projector system. And every night during the summer, that projector displays digital animated art on the side of the merchandise mart. It's called Art on the Mart. It's already started, and it typically starts around 8:45 or 9 p.m. And the coolest part about it is that the art only shines on the walls and not through the windows. So a really difficult design process to make sure that the light doesn't shine through those windows and disturb the tenants. Now, the Chicago River, I talked about how polluted it was, right? As recently as the 80s. Well, in the 70s, there were only 10 species of fish in the river. But now, due to some important ecological efforts, there are 78 species of fish in the river. So that shows you how much this river has cleaned its act up. All right, quick example of contextualism. Over to the right. This Art Deco building with the Centro Tower sticking out. That reflective glass building to the left with the 3-column setbacks. The first setback is at the height of the first roof of the Art Deco building. The second is at the same height as the second roof of the Art Deco. And the third is at the same height as that neoclassical building that we talked about earlier. So again, that's contextualism. It's hiding in plain sight. All right, we're passing under the Lasalle Street Bridge. Now, this bridge might look a little wider to you than some of the other bridges, most of the other bridges we passed under. And that's because in 1930, the city wanted to expand Lasalle Street. The problem was this brick building here on the left. This is the Reed Murdoch Center, built in 1914. And if you look closely, there are 6 bays of windows on the right and 5 bays of windows on the left of the clock tower. And that's because when they expanded LaSalle Street, they just chopped the end of the building off. Said, you can stay, but you're getting chopped. All right, to the right, this short, squat concrete building with a 55 on it. This is an example of a short-lived architectural style from the late 1960s called Brutalism. Now, yes, it does look brutal with its deep inset dark windows and that very specific dark concrete, but Brutalism actually comes from the French béton brut, which means raw or rough concrete. This style was usually found in sturdy institutional buildings like banks and courthouses. We have affectionately nicknamed this building the Danny DeVito. No shade to Danny, I love him, but he is sandwiched here between 2 supermodels. Now, this supermodel on the left is the Leo Burnett, this black and gray building, and that 2-story belt that sticks out of the middle of that building is at the same height as the roof of number 55. So again, those 5 buildings that we just passed on the right, you can see how they're all connected to each other in some way through their context, and that's contextualism. All right, straight ahead and a little to the right It's got the sun shining on that tower. It's a little green with the gold leaf on top. That building is the Carbide and Carbide building, another Art Deco building from 1929. And I like to talk about this building because it has a great story. So, the 20s was also during Prohibition, and Prohibition was the period in American history where alcohol was illegal. So it was said that that building was designed to look like a champagne bottle as a smack in the face to the forces behind Prohibition. Always love a little bit of flouting authority, don't we? Now, the gold trim on top is real 24-karat gold leaf. But before you get a bright idea to go scrape it off, it's actually only half the thickness of saran wrap, so you wouldn't make much money off of it. Yes, the temperature really is changing. We got a cool breeze coming in from the lakefront. That happens a lot. Where I live, sometimes just 2 blocks further in from the lakefront, it's like 10 degrees warmer. That's called lake effect for you. Now to the right, I just want to draw your attention to these 4 buildings coming into view that are all built right next to each other. And these are the only 4 buildings on the tour that you're going to see that are built like that. Those of you from the East Coast, this might look more familiar. East Coast cities are a little older, they have a little less space, and therefore they have to build this close together, right? But here in Chicago and in the Midwest, we do have a little bit more space, so this is unusual. But if you look over here to the left, this is a great comparison between Chicago architecture and East Coast architecture. So we have a lot of space around these buildings on the left, but no space between these buildings on the right. All right, remember the Wrigley Building? That was one of the first buildings we talked about with this clock tower on top. And this was modeled after a Spanish cathedral. Our next cathedral is coming into view, and that's this. It looks like another cathedral, right? It's the Chicago Tribune Tower just to the right. And this is actually modeled after a cathedral in France.
Es el que está
so this
abandonado.
is called the French Gothic Revival style of architecture. And this is Chicago Tribune Tower. Now the Tribune operated out of that building until about 2018. And then it sold the building, and now it's being converted into high-end condos. We're talking millions of dollars to purchase one of those condos in there. I don't even want to think about how much those are going to cost at the end of the day. But yeah, beautiful building, very historic. It's, at this point, just about 100 years old. All right, so we have our Wrigley Building, which was modeled after a Spanish cathedral, right? We have our Chicago Tribune Tower, which was modeled after a French cathedral. And coming into view on the left, we have our third cathedral, the Apple Store. Now, this is a cathedral to technological innovation, you would say, right? Those glass walls are semi-structural, so they partially support the roof, which was intended to look a bit like an iPad or a MacBook Air. And this is also a really important site, because the Apple Store is built on what is believed to be the original site of DuSable's homestead. Again, DuSable, the founder of the city, a Haitian immigrant. So this is a very historic site here in Chicago. It was believed his cabin sat right there. All right. Staying on the left, this building towering above this University of Chicago building that has the spire on top and the peacock, of course, that is NBC Tower. Now this building was modeled after 30 Rockefeller Center in New York City. Now 30 Rock is NBC's headquarters, and it was built in the 1920s, and it's an Art Deco building. So, since this is a replica of 30 Rock, we refer to this style as Eco Deco, which is basically just a cutesy way of saying a modern reimagining of the Art Deco style. But it's a great example of those vertical racing stripes. So I challenge you specifically with contextualism and Art Deco, those two styles. If you live in the United States and you go back home to your city, see if you can spot either of those styles there, because I bet you could, especially after this tour. All right, to the right, you have the Swiss Hotel, the black box next to it. Well, that building coming into view that looks like it's covered in fins behind it, that is Aqua Tower. Now, those fins are actually all balconies, and they're all uniquely shaped. There aren't two that are the same size and shape. And I like to talk about that building because it was designed by Jeannie Gang. Remember, she designed the St. Regis, this first building that we talked about coming back up on the right. So a really important architect again here in Chicago. All right. Now, I want to go back to the St. Regis. Remember the wavy building with the 3 different height towers? And that's because there's a lot to talk about. And I want to focus on those 2 floors near the top of the tall tower there that don't have windows. Now, remember the inertial slosh dampers for the 150 North Riverside? That was those barrels of water that minimized the sway. Well, this is a similar system, and those are called blow-through floors. So they're never going to have windows on them. And that's so that when wind hits the side of that tall tower, a lot of it is going to be funneled through those 2 floors, and that will reduce the stress on the side of the building, and thereby will minimize the sway. It actually sort of cuts the sway off before it even starts. So again, another really important innovation that allows these buildings to be nice and secure and be able to be really, really tall. I love the St. Regis, though. It's a beautiful addition to the Chicago skyline, especially once we get out here by the dock again, you'll see. Now, this is the part of the tour where I'm going to brag a little bit, so bear with me. Now, for the past few years, TripAdvisor has ranked this tour that you're on with us right now as the #1 tour experience in the country, which we're very proud of. Also, though, the #2 tour experience in the world. Second to who? The Vatican. Of course it's the Vatican. But look out, Pope Francis, watch your back, we're coming for you. Now, I say all that, yeah, to brag, but also this is my 4th week of being a docent here at Shoreline, and so I just went through the process of having to learn all this information, and I say all that because I want y'all to know that we take this job seriously. We really want to give you a good time, teach you some things about a city that we all love so much, so I do hope you've enjoyed yourselves this evening. You picked a beautiful day. Now, over here to the left, this curvy black building that looks like a stack of fidget spinners, this is Lake Point Tower, an example of curvilinear modernism. And I want to point out that this structure on top, that actually used to house a restaurant called Civic. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, Civic had to close down, but the space is up for lease. So, if you're looking to move to Chicago and open a fancy restaurant, the best spot in town is available. Even better, they're open to rezoning it for residential use, so you can actually live up there if you wanted to. Now, if you have the money to live up there, whew, maybe you can pay my rent too. Probably the best view in the city, though. Now, Chicago has 2.9 million people in the city, about 9 million people in the broader metro area. That makes us the 3rd largest city in the country, behind New York City and Los Angeles. And another nickname that we have is the City on the Lake. Of course, that's referring to Lake Michigan, straight ahead. We have a 28-mile lakefront, 21 swimming beaches, 5,300 boat slips, 10 harbors, probably the most extensive harbor system in the country. And the best part about those beaches is that they're nice freshwater beaches. So if you are 34 years old and still unreasonably afraid of sharks, there are no sharks. How great is that? Now you can see up here, you see that gate on the right, sort of in the corner of those 2 concrete walls. That's the Chicago Lock. And a lock is used to transport vessels between 2 bodies of water that are at different heights. Now, the lake is at a record high. It's 6 feet above the river, right? 6 feet taller, higher than the river. So the way that it works is that door opens, your boat goes in there, the door closes behind you, the water level raises the 6 feet to the same height as the lake, and the door on the other side opens and you can then go out. Pretty important here for travel between the river and the lake. All right, we are heading back to the dock now. So I'm going to ask you to all stay seated from here until we reach the dock. Imagine that I have a sign above my head that says, "Stay in your seats." And when you see the deck hands come up here and open the gate, then you'll know you're good to stand up. Now, I'll be the first person off the boat standing at the top of the ramp available to answer any questions you might have, give you some recommendations, or if you just want to give me a hard time, jokes, that's fine too.